The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The audience was buzzing with excitement as Tom Hiddleston, fresh off his latest critically acclaimed performance, walked onto the stage with his trademark charm and that signature smile that has won over millions of fans worldwide. The British actor, known for his impeccable manners and diplomatic responses in interviews, seemed relaxed as he settled into the guest chair. But what nobody in that studio audience could have predicted was that within minutes, this would transform into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Kimmel opened with his usual banter, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight. Those who know the host well could sense an underlying edge to his questions, a subtle aggressiveness that seemed to catch even the seasoned actor off guard. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough, with Hiddleston discussing his latest project with his characteristic eloquence and thoughtful responses. But seasoned viewers of the show would later point out that Kimmel's interruptions were more frequent than usual, his jokes landing with a sharper bite than typical. The conversation took its first uncomfortable turn when Kimmel brought up Hiddleston's recent comments about method acting and the responsibility that comes with portraying complex characters. What should have been a straightforward discussion about craft quickly became something much more personal and pointed. Kimmel's questions grew increasingly invasive, probing into Hiddleston's personal philosophy and challenging his approach to his work in ways that seemed designed to provoke rather than illuminate. "You know, Tom," Kimmel said with that familiar smirk, but his tone carried an undertone that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. For someone who talks so much about authenticity and truth in performance, "You sure do" seemed to have a lot of carefully rehearsed answers. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since sitting down, Hiddleston's polite smile faltered slightly. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but those watching closely could see the first crack in his diplomatic facade. Hiddleston maintained his composure, responding with measured words about the importance of being thoughtful in interviews, but Kimmel wasn't finished. He pressed further, questioning whether Hiddleston's public persona was just another performance, suggesting that the actor's well-known charitable work and advocacy might be nothing more than calculated image management. The accusation was delivered with Kimmel's trademark grin, but the malicious intent was unmistakable to everyone in the room. The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Audience members later described feeling the atmosphere shift dramatically, as Hiddleston's jaw tightened and his posture straightened. This was no longer a friendly late-night chat between host and guest. Something fundamental had changed, and the British actor's famous patience was beginning to show signs of strain. His responses became shorter, more clipped, and those familiar with his work could recognize the controlled intensity that he typically reserved for his most dramatic roles now creeping into his real-life demeanor. But this was only the beginning of what would become a complete meltdown of professional courtesy. And what happened next would push one of Hollywood's most respected actors beyond his limits. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. Kimmel, sensing that he had successfully rattled his typically unflappable guest, decided to double down on his attack. He leaned back in his chair with that infuriating smugness that his critics have long complained about, and delivered what can only be described as a calculated assassination of Hiddleston's character. "I have to ask, Tom, because our audience deserves honesty," Kimmel said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Do you ever get tired of being so perfect all the time? I mean, the constant charity work, the thoughtful interviews, the way you never seem to put a foot wrong. It's almost like you're afraid to be human." The question landed like a slap across the face. Hiddleston's composure, which had been hanging by a thread, visibly cracked. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the armrests of his chair, slowly clenched into fists. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. This wasn't the diplomatic Tom Hiddleston that audiences had come to know and love. This was someone who had been pushed too far by a host who seemed determined to strip away every layer of professionalism and decency. "I'm sorry, Jimmy," Hiddleston replied, his voice still controlled but carrying a dangerous edge that made several audience members lean forward in their seats. "But I'm not sure I understand what you're implying. Are you suggesting that kindness and thoughtfulness are somehow inauthentic? That caring about causes larger than oneself is performative?" The way he emphasized the word performative made it clear that he was throwing Kimmel's earlier accusation back at him, and the host's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed venom. Kimmel wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed energized by Hiddleston's pushback, as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment to pounce. "What I'm saying is that nobody's that good, Tom. Nobody's that perfect. And frankly, it makes people suspicious. It makes them wonder what you're hiding." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and you could practically hear the collective intake of breath from the studio audience. This had crossed every line of professional conduct, but Kimmel wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent, and delivered the coup de grace. "Maybe that's why your personal relationships never seem to work out. Maybe people get tired of dating a performance instead of a person." The words cut through the studio like a knife, and the silence that followed was deafening. Hiddleston went completely still, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The cameras caught every micro-expression, every tightening of his jaw, every flash of anger that crossed his features. This was no longer about professional disagreement or artistic philosophy. This was personal, vicious, and completely unprovoked. The British actor's response came in a voice so quiet and controlled that it was somehow more terrifying than if he had shouted. "I think," he said, each word measured and precise, "that you've crossed a line tonight, Jimmy. A line that has nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with basic human decency." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Hiddleston's famous politeness gave way to something much more dangerous. His accent became more pronounced, the way it always did when he was truly angry, and those who knew him well would later say they had never seen him this close to losing control. But Kimmel, drunk on his own power and the reaction he was getting, made the fatal mistake of pressing his advantage even further. What he said next would be the point of no return, the moment that transformed a professional disagreement into a declaration of war. "You know what, Tom?" Kimmel said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that sent chills through everyone present. "I think I've figured out what bothers me about you. You're like that kid in school who always had to be the teacher's pet, always had to show everyone else up, always so concerned with being seen as the good guy that you forgot how to be real." He paused for effect, savoring the moment like a predator playing with wounded prey. "Maybe that's why you play villains so well. Maybe it's the only time you get to be yourself." The words hit Hiddleston like a physical blow. His entire body went rigid, and for a moment it seemed like he might actually launch himself across the space between them. The cameras captured every second of his internal struggle, the war between his ingrained British politeness and his rapidly rising fury. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a thunderclap. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," Hiddleston said, his composure finally beginning to crack in earnest. "You sit behind this desk night after night, hiding behind your writers and your carefully crafted persona, taking cheap shots at people who come here in good faith. You want to talk about performance? Let's talk about yours." The gloves were officially off now, and the studio audience sat in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most diplomatic actors prepared to dismantle his host on live television. Kimmel's smirk wavered as he realized he might have finally picked a fight with someone who wouldn't back down. But his ego wouldn't let him retreat now, not with the cameras rolling and his reputation on the line. "Oh, now we're getting somewhere," he said, trying to maintain his casual demeanor but failing to hide the nervousness creeping into his voice. "Finally, a little honesty from the saint of Hollywood." "Honesty?" Hiddleston's voice rose for the first time since the interview began, and the raw emotion in it made several audience members gasp audibly. You want honesty, Jimmy? Here's some honesty for you. I came here tonight to talk about my work, to connect with an audience, to do what actors do. Instead, I find myself sitting across from someone who seems more interested in tearing people down than building anything up. You've spent the last 10 minutes attacking my character, my relationships, my motivations. And for what? For ratings? For the cheap thrill of watching someone squirm? The accusation landed with devastating accuracy, and Kimmel's face flushed red. The host was no longer in control of the situation, and everyone in the studio knew it. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and Hiddleston was just getting started. You talk about authenticity, the actor continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. But what's authentic about hiding behind a desk and a microphone while you launch personal attacks at your guests? What's authentic about using your platform to bully people who can't fight back without looking unprofessional? The word bully hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Kimmel's face went from red to purple, and his hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Now wait just a minute," he sputtered, his carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crumble under the weight of Hiddleston's counterattack. But Hiddleston wasn't finished. Years of diplomatic responses and swallowed insults seemed to pour out of him all at once. "No, Jimmy, you wait. You want to psychoanalyze me on live television? Let's turn that lens around. What kind of person builds a career on making others uncomfortable? What kind of man gets his kicks from attacking people who are just trying to do their job?" The questions came rapid fire, each one more damaging than the last. The studio was electric with tension now, the audience caught between horror and fascination as they witnessed what was clearly an unprecedented meltdown of professional courtesy. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a genuine confrontation between two men who had reached the point where civility was no longer possible. And as Kimmel opened his mouth to respond with what would clearly be another inflammatory comment, it became obvious that this powder keg was about to explode completely. What came out of Kimmel's mouth next would be remembered as the moment he destroyed his own career on live television. "You know what your problem is, Tom?" he snarled, all pretense of humor gone from his voice. "You're just another pretentious British actor who thinks he's better than everyone else. You come to America, you take our roles, and then you lecture us about decency and professionalism. Maybe you should go back to wherever you came from and leave the real entertainment to the professionals." The xenophobic undertone of the comment sent shockwaves through the studio. Several audience members audibly gasped, and you could see the horror on the faces of the production crew as they realized their host had just committed career suicide on live television. But Hiddleston's reaction was the most stunning of all. Instead of exploding into rage as everyone expected, he went completely still. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had just been handed complete moral victory. "There it is," Hiddleston said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire studio. "There's your authentic self, Jimmy." The mask finally slips, and what do we find underneath? Exactly what I suspected. A small, insecure man who builds himself up by tearing others down. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, every inch the consummate professional even in the face of such unprovoked hostility. "I've spent the last 15 minutes trying to understand why you were attacking me so viciously. And now I know. It's not about me at all. It's about you." The cameras captured every moment as Hiddleston reached for his microphone and carefully removed it, his movements precise and dignified. The contrast between his composed professionalism and Kimmel's obvious panic was stark and damning. "You, see?" Hiddleston continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I came here tonight to talk about storytelling, about the craft of acting, about connecting with audiences through shared human experiences. Instead, I find myself across from someone who seems to have forgotten what those things mean. Someone who's so disconnected from basic human decency that he thinks personal attacks constitute entertainment. Kimmel tried to interject, his face now a mask of desperation as he realized the interview had spiraled completely out of his control. Now hold on, Tom. I think you're taking this too seriously. It's just television. It's just jokes. No, Jimmy, Hiddleston cut him off with quiet authority. It's not just jokes. It's a pattern. It's a choice. And tonight, you chose to show your audience exactly who you really are. He straightened, his jacket with the same care he might take preparing for a red carpet appearance, transforming what could have been a humiliating retreat into a moment of dignified defiance. The tragedy is that you have this platform, this opportunity to bring joy and connection to people's lives, and you've chosen to use it for cruelty instead. The studio was dead silent now, the audience hanging on every word as they witnessed one of the most devastating takedowns in television history. Hiddleston moved toward the edge of the stage, but he wasn't finished. He turned back to face Kimmel one final time, and what he said next would be quoted across social media for weeks to come. You asked me earlier about authenticity, about being real. Well, here's something real for you. I feel genuinely sorry for you. Sorry that you're so threatened by other people's success that you have to tear them down to feel better about yourself. Sorry that you've confused cynicism with intelligence and cruelty with humor. And most of all, sorry for your audience, who deserves so much better than what you gave them tonight. With that, Tom Hiddleston walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from the encounter. The cameras captured Kimmel's stunned face as he sat alone at his desk, the silence in the studio deafening. What had started as a routine promotional interview had become a masterclass in how to destroy one's own reputation in real time, and the aftermath would dominate headlines for months to come. The incident sparked immediate outrage on social media, with clips of the confrontation going viral within hours and leading to widespread calls for Kimmel's resignation. The host's ratings plummeted overnight, and several major guests canceled their upcoming appearances, unwilling to associate themselves with someone who had shown such unprofessional conduct. In the end, Hiddleston's dignified exit had accomplished something no amount of scripted comebacks could have achieved. It had revealed the true character of both men, and the audience had rendered their verdict without a single vote being cast.